The last wagon out of Caldwell, Kansas was scheduled to leave at noon on the 14th of September, 1878, and every soul in town knew that anyone left behind would be spending the winter alone in a place that was about to become the most dangerous stretch of prairie in the entire territory. Lenora Brenner had been standing at the edge of the main road since before sunup, her travel bag clutched against her chest, her dark hair pinned beneath a bonnet that had seen better days but still held its shape with a kind of dignified stubbornness that matched the woman wearing it. She was 24 years old, recently widowed, and entirely alone in a world that had not been particularly kind to women who found themselves in that condition. Her husband, Robert Brenner, had died of a fever 6 weeks prior, leaving her with a small sum of savings, a rented room above the general store, and no family within 500 miles. The plan, such as it was, had always been to go west together, to find land in Colorado or maybe further north, to build something from nothing the way young couples did when they had more courage than sense. Robert had believed in that dream with his whole chest. Lenora had believed in Robert. Now Robert was in the ground behind the Baptist church, and Lenora was alone with the dream and none of the company. The wagon master, a thick-armed man named Delray Pratt who wore his authority the way some men wore their Sunday best, uncomfortable but insisting upon it, had posted the notice 3 days ago. The Comanche raids south of Caldwell had pushed the Army's supply lines thin, and the new railroad spur that everyone had been counting on for safe passage was still 3 months from completion. Anyone who wanted safe escort to Fort Dodge or beyond needed to be on that wagon. Spaces were limited to 12 passengers because of the weight of supplies they'd be carrying. Every spot had been claimed within the hour of posting. Lenora had not been fast enough. She'd been sitting with her grief and her Bible and her uncertainty, and by the time she'd walked down to Pratt's office, he'd shaken his head with the practiced sorrow of a man who regretted things only slightly more than he regretted the inconvenience of having to say them. 12 spots, ma'am. Everyone filled. Next wagon won't be organized until spring. You might find winter lodging at the Caldwell boarding house if Mrs. Greer still has rooms. She had thanked him politely because Lenora Brenner had been raised to be polite even when politeness felt like swallowing glass, and she had walked back to her rented room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at the wall for a very long time. That had been yesterday. Today she was standing at the edge of the road because she could not think of what else to do. She was watching the wagon get loaded, watching the 12 passengers mill about with their belongings, watching the horses stamp and toss their heads in the early morning cool, and she was trying to figure out if there was any world in which a woman with a travel bag and a quiet desperation could appeal to Delray Pratt's better nature one more time. That was when she first noticed Isaiah Keene. He was not hard to notice. He was tall in the way that some men are tall without effort, without vanity, the kind of tall that is simply a fact of them the way that rivers run downhill. He had broad shoulders wrapped in a worn canvas coat, dark brown hair that curled slightly where it brushed the back of his collar, and a face that suggested he had spent the majority of his 28 years outdoors, not out of fashion but out of necessity. There was a quietness to him, a deliberate quality in the way he moved, as though he had learned long ago that careful movement was almost always more useful than fast movement. He was checking the cinch on a roan mare tied to the post outside the livery, and he was doing it with the focused attention of a man who trusted his hands more than most things. Lenora would not have given him more than a passing glance. She was too occupied with her own crisis to spend attention on strangers, except that she noticed him stop what he was doing and look over at her. Not the way men sometimes looked at young women, not with assessment or hunger, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as though he had noticed something in her posture that told him a story. She looked away. She straightened her spine and walked toward Delray Pratt's wagon one more time. "Mr. Pratt," she said, keeping her voice even, "I understand the spaces are filled. I'm not asking for charity. I have money enough to pay for the passage and then some. I am asking you to consider that there may be room for one more if someone were willing to make space. I can sit small. I don't take up much. I have one bag." Pratt looked at her with the expression of a man who has had this conversation before and did not enjoy it the first time. "Mrs. Brenner, I understand your situation is difficult, but 12 is 12 because of the weight, not because I'm particular about the number. Any more and we overburden the horses and then nobody makes it to Fort Dodge. There must be some solution," she said. "There is a solution," he replied. "Mrs. Greer's boarding house. Caldwell isn't so bad in winter if you stay indoors. Mr. Pratt." She kept the desperation out of her voice. It cost her something to do it. "I have a sister in Denver. I have not seen her in 3 years. I have just buried my husband. I need to go home." Something moved behind his eyes, a brief flicker of human sympathy, but it was quickly reorganized by the practical machinery of his professional obligations. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. I truly am. 12 spots is 12 spots. There's nothing to be done." She stood there for one more moment, and then she nodded once, precisely, turned and walked back toward the edge of the road. She would not cry in front of Delray Pratt or the assembled passengers or the horses. She had decided that before she'd walked over there, and she intended to keep to it. "You're trying to get a spot on the wagon." The voice came from behind her and slightly to the left, and it was not a question posed with any particular sharpness or intrusion. It was simply a man observing a thing he had seen and naming it. She turned. Isaiah Keene was standing a few feet away, his hat in his hand, his expression one of careful attention. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a very dark shade of blue, the kind that looked almost brown in certain light, and that there was a small scar through his left eyebrow that suggested someone had thrown something at him at some point in the past. "I am," she said, because there seemed no point in pretending otherwise. "You didn't get one in time," he said. "No," she agreed. "I did not." He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the wagon, then he looked back at her. There was something happening behind those dark blue eyes, something working through calculations she could not see. "Where are you trying to get to?" "Fort Dodge first. Then I'll make arrangements from there to get to Denver. I have a sister there. My name is Lenora Brenner. My husband died 6 weeks ago, and I have been putting off the decision to leave because I did not know what to do, and by the time I knew what to do, the spots were gone." She did not know why she told him all of that. She was not in the habit of telling strangers her business, but there was something about the way he asked that made it feel reasonable to answer. He nodded slowly. He put his hat back on his head. Then he turned and walked toward Delray Pratt. Lenora watched, uncomprehending, as Isaiah Keene had a brief conversation with the wagon master. She could not hear the words from where she stood, but she could see Pratt's eyebrows rise and then lower, and then he nodded in a way that suggested he was not entirely sure he was understanding correctly but was willing to accept it. Keene shook his hand, turned around and walked back to Lenora. "You've got a spot," he said. She stared at him. "I beg your pardon. On the wagon you've got a spot." "But Mr. Pratt said 12 spots was—" She stopped. The understanding arrived slowly, like light coming in under a closed door. "You gave me your spot." "I did," he said, with the same matter-of-fact quality he might have used to say he had saddled his horse or eaten his breakfast. "Mr. Keene," she said, because she had heard Pratt address him by name during their exchange and had filed it away without meaning to, "you can't do that. You need to get somewhere too." "Where were you going?" "Fort Dodge," he said. "Then north, maybe. I've got work up near the Kansas-Colorado line." "Cattle operation, not particularly urgent." He paused. "Yours seems more urgent." "It is winter," she said. "The next wagon isn't until spring. Where will you stay?" "I'll find work here," he said simply. "I always find work. I've been finding work since I was 17. I'm not worried about it." "You can't simply, Mr. Keene. That is extraordinarily generous and I cannot accept it." He looked at her with a patience that suggested he had considered objections before offering the thing and was not troubled by them. "Mrs. Brenner," he said, "you have a sister in Denver, and you've just buried your husband and winter is coming. I have a horse and a bedroll and skills that pay wages wherever there are cattle and fences. Take the spot, please." The word please, delivered quietly and without performance, was what undid her. It was not a word that people used when they were seeking credit for generosity. It was a word used by people who meant the thing they were saying. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother was widowed when I was 10. My father died in an accident on the cattle drive. She was alone with me and my 2 younger sisters in a place that was not kind to women alone. She had family in Missouri, but nobody helped her get there. She managed. She always managed. But she shouldn't have had to manage alone." He stopped. "That's all, it's not complicated." Lenora looked at Isaiah Keene for a long moment, and she felt something in her chest shift in a way she could not name and did not try to name, because naming it would have required a kind of introspection she was not prepared for at 7 in the morning in front of a loading wagon in Caldwell, Kansas. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I mean that, genuinely." He nodded. "You should go get your bag. Pratt wants to leave by noon and he means it." She went to get her bag. The wagon rolled out of Caldwell at 3 minutes past noon, Lenora Brenner seated among 11 other passengers on the rough wooden benches inside the canvas-covered bed, her travel bag tucked beneath her feet and her hands folded in her lap. Through the gap in the back of the canvas, as they passed the last building on the edge of town, she looked back. Isaiah Keene was standing in front of the livery with his horse, watching the wagon go. He raised one hand when he saw her looking. She raised one hand in return. Then the wagon turned north and the prairie swallowed the view and she could no longer see him. She told herself that was fine. It was fine. She had her spot. He had his reasons. It was a clean exchange, and that was the end of it. And she turned her face forward and tried to think about Denver and her sister Clara, and the life she was going to build from the pieces of the one she'd had. The road to Fort Dodge was 4 days in good weather, longer in bad, and the weather in September on the Kansas plains was not above changing its mind without notice. By the second day, Lenora had established something like a rhythm with the other passengers. There was a family from Ohio, the Havorson family, a husband and wife with 2 children under 10 and a third on the way, who were cheerful and exhausted in equal measure. There was a pair of brothers named Teague, older men with weathered faces, and very little to say, who seemed to communicate mostly through nods and silence. There was a schoolteacher named Miss Aldridge who was 26 and had been hired to open a school in Dodge City and was visibly thrilled about it. There was a merchant named Colfax who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke too loudly and had opinions about everything, all of which he shared freely. Lenora liked Miss Aldridge. They sat together on the second afternoon, while the wagon rolled through the golden grass, and talked about books, which was something Lenora had not done with anyone since Robert died. Robert had not been particularly bookish, but he had tolerated her love of reading with a generous affection that she had, in retrospect, perhaps not appreciated as fully as she ought to have. "What will you do in Denver?" Miss Aldridge asked. "Start over," Lenora said. It was the most honest answer she had. "That takes courage," Miss Aldridge said. "Or desperation," Lenora replied. Miss Aldridge laughed. "In my experience, those are the same thing dressed differently." On the third day, the weather changed. The sky in the west went the color of a bruise at mid-morning, and by early afternoon the wind had picked up enough to make the canvas of the wagon snap and billow like an angry flag. Delray Pratt called a halt at a creek crossing to water the horses and assess the situation, and the passengers climbed down to stretch their legs in the rising wind and look at the sky with the shared unease of people who knew that the prairie was not sentimental about the people crossing it. "How far to the next station?" the merchant Colfax asked Pratt. 8 miles, Pratt said. "We push through. We can make it before it breaks bad, but I won't lie to you, it's going to be a rough 8 miles. They pushed through. It was indeed rough. The storm came in fast, the way prairie storms do, without staging or warning, just the sudden arrival of everything it had been building all day. The rain came horizontally in cold sheets, and the horses leaned into their harnesses with the strained effort of animals working against something serious. The creek crossing on the far side of the stretch became a mudded, slipping thing that required Pratt and his outrider, a young man named Byers, to climb down and guide the horses through while the passengers held onto the sides and each other and tried to keep the children from tipping out. Mrs. Havorson's youngest, a boy of about 4, was crying steadily but without much enthusiasm, which suggested to Lenora he had been crying for some time already and had reached the territory beyond urgent fear into simple exhaustion. She pulled him into her lap without asking and held him against her coat, and he settled almost immediately, which surprised her and did not surprise her in equal measure. They reached the waystation, a low-built sod building with a barn attached, as the worst of the storm was making its presence felt, and everyone piled inside with the particular gratitude of people who have been reminded that walls and roofs are not small things. The waystation keeper was an old woman named Mrs. Follett, who moved with the efficiency of someone who had been handling emergencies since before most of her current guests were born. She had soup on almost immediately and dry blankets distributed with the orderly practicality of a woman who had learned that sentiment was best expressed through action. Lenora was wringing water from the hem of her skirt near the fire when the door of the waystation opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air, and a figure entirely soaked from hat to boot, leading a horse by the reins. She looked up. It was Isaiah Keene. He stood in the doorway, dripping, his hat dark with rain, his canvas coat turned almost black with it. He looked around the room, his eyes finding people, counting them, and then his eyes found Lenora and something in them shifted, something that in better light she might have read more clearly. "Mr. Keene," she said, and she was on her feet before she had quite decided to stand up. How are you here?" "Rode out the same day," he said, moving to let Mrs. Follett take his horse's reins. He pulled off his dripping hat. "Figured I'd follow the wagon route north. Work to be had at the way stations and the ranch operations along the way. Got caught in the storm about 3 miles back. Saw the light here." He said it simply. He did not say he had been following the wagon. He did not say he had been watching out for anyone. He said he had been riding north and had found shelter the same as anyone would, but he had known the wagon route, and he had been 3 miles behind them. Lenora studied him for a moment, and then she decided, deliberately, not to examine the thing too closely just yet. "Come to the fire," she said instead. "Mrs. Follett has soup." He came to the fire. He sat across from her while the storm worked itself out against the sod walls, and he ate his soup with the concentrated attention of a genuinely hungry man, and she watched him without meaning to, and looked away each time he glanced up. Miss Aldridge, seated beside Lenora, leaned over with a small and interested expression. "Is that the man who gave you his spot?" she murmured. "Yes," Lenora said. "He's very handsome," Miss Aldridge observed. "I hadn't noticed," Lenora said. Miss Aldridge's small and interested expression became considerably more pointed. "You are a terrible liar, Mrs. Brenner." Lenora did not dignify that with a response, but she felt warmth in her face that had nothing to do with the fire. After the soup and after the children were settled, and most of the passengers had found corners to sleep in, Lenora found herself sitting near the fire in the quiet way that people sometimes do when they cannot sleep in a strange place, and the rain outside is loud enough to make sitting with it feel almost peaceful. Isaiah Keene was still awake too, she realized. He was on the other side of the fire, cleaning and checking his revolver with the automatic thoroughness of a man who maintained his equipment as a matter of habit rather than theater. "You don't have to explain yourself," she said quietly, so as not to wake anyone. "Following the wagon route, I mean." He looked up. In the firelight his eyes were darker, warmer. "I wasn't sure it was obvious," he said. "It wasn't. Miss Aldridge thought it was very romantic." Something that might have been amusement crossed his face. "What did you think?" She considered that honestly. "I thought it was kind," she said, "and a little worrying, because if you're riding north for the same reasons I think you might be riding north, then you've given up quite a lot on behalf of someone you met for 10 minutes in front of a livery." He was quiet for a moment. He set the revolver down and looked at the fire. "My father's name was Isaiah Keene," he said. "He worked cattle drives from the time he was 20 until the day he died. He used to say that the measure of a man wasn't what he kept for himself, it was what he made sure other people had." He paused. "I didn't always think that was much of a philosophy. When you're young and hungry, generosity seems like something rich people say to feel better about being rich." But he meant it practically. He meant it specifically. He was always the man who made sure someone else had the last of the water or the last of the shelter. He died doing it, actually. Gave up his place in a shelter during a lightning storm so a younger hand could get in out of it. Lightning hit the tree he was standing under. Lenora was quiet, listening. "I used to be angry at him for that," Isaiah continued. "For years. I was angry because he left us, because he left my mother alone, because he gave the shelter to someone else and the lightning made no distinction about who deserved it. But I got older and I understood it differently. He didn't do it thinking about the lightning. He did it thinking about the hand who needed shelter. He did what he thought was right and the world did what the world does. You can't control the world. You can only control what you do in it." He looked at her across the fire. "You needed the spot more than I did. That was simple." "It wasn't simple," she said. "You stayed behind. You'll be stuck in Caldwell through winter or worse." "I'm not stuck in Caldwell," he said. "I'm here, aren't I?" That was true. He was here. 3 miles behind the wagon, riding through a storm, seated across a fire in a waystation on the road to Fort Dodge. He was here. "Why?" she asked, for the second time since they'd met. He looked at her steadily. "Because when that wagon pulled away and I watched it go, I thought about you on it, and I realized I wanted to know that you got where you were going. And then I thought about Colorado and the cattle work, and I thought." He stopped. He looked at the fire again. "I thought it could wait." The rain beat against the sod roof. The fire crackled. Somewhere behind them, one of the Havorson children muttered something in sleep and then was quiet. Lenora did not say anything for a moment. She was trying to organize something inside herself, trying to arrange things in an order that made sense. She was 6 weeks widowed. She was on a wagon to Fort Dodge. She had known this man for approximately 3 days, 2 of which she had not been in the same location as him. And yet, "My husband was a good man," she said quietly. It seemed important to say it. It seemed important for Isaiah Keene to understand that she was not someone who took the people she loved lightly. He was kind and he was brave and he had plans that were bigger than most people's hopes, and I believed in every one of them. I loved him. "I know," Isaiah said softly. "That's clear. I don't know what I'm doing," she said, "with any of it, the going to Denver, the starting over, any of it." "You don't have to know right now," he said. "Right now you just have to get to Fort Dodge." "And you?" He met her eyes. "Right now I just have to get you there safely," he said. "The rest can figure itself out later." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of anything that the world might hold too early or too tightly. It was simply a man telling a woman what was true for him in this moment, in this waystation, in this storm. It was honest and it was specific, and it was, Lenora thought, one of the most straightforwardly tender things anyone had said to her in a very long time. "All right," she said. "Then we'll get to Fort Dodge." "All right," he agreed. They sat by the fire a while longer, not talking, while the rain ran down the outside of the sod walls and the other passengers slept, and Lenora felt something she had thought might be entirely extinguished inside her produce, a small, careful warmth. She did not name it. She just let it be. The storm passed in the night, and the 4th day dawned with the particular clarity that follows a hard rain. The sky scrubbed clean and brilliant, the grass greener than it had been, the road ahead visible for miles in the thin September light. They reached Fort Dodge by mid-afternoon, the wagon rumbling through the gates of the fortified settlement with the weary satisfaction of a journey completed. Fort Dodge in 1878 was a place that occupied an interesting middle ground between frontier hardship and genuine civilization. The fort itself was a proper military installation, but around it had grown a community of merchants, settlers, tradespeople, and travelers that made it, in effect, a small town with added firearms. There was a hotel, A telegraph office, a dry goods store, a livery, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays, and a doctor. It was not Denver, but it was something. Lenora stepped down from the wagon into the dry afternoon air and looked around at the place with the slightly dazed quality of someone who has been in motion for 4 days and is readjusting to stillness. Isaiah Keene rode in 20 minutes after the wagon, his roan mare picking her way carefully through the gate with the dignified exhaustion of an animal that has covered a great deal of ground. He found Lenora at the small hotel desk, arranging a room. "Settled?" he asked. "Getting there," she said. She looked at him. He was dusty from the road, his coat still carrying traces of the previous night's rain in the set of the fabric, and he looked tired in a comfortable way, tired in the way of someone who had done something and was not sorry about having done it. "And you?" "I'll check with the livery about work," he said. "They usually need hands for the winter supply runs." "Isaiah," she said, and then stopped because she had used his given name without thinking, and it had come out with a naturalness that surprised her slightly. He noticed. He didn't comment on it, but something in his expression acknowledged it, a small warmth that was there and then arranged itself back into patience. "I want to have supper with you," she said. "This evening, not as a repayment or a thank you, just because," she paused, "because I would like to." He considered this very briefly, and then he said, "So would I." They had supper in the hotel's small dining room, which smelled of wood smoke and boiled coffee, and something that might have been stew, and which had 4 other occupied tables, none of whose occupants paid any particular attention to them. They talked for 2 hours. About his childhood in Texas, his father and mother, and the 2 younger sisters who were both now married to good men in Abilene. About her childhood in Indiana, her own mother who had died when she was 16, and her father who had remarried, and her sister Clara in Denver, who had married a surveyor named Thomas and had 2 children and a house with real floors. About what they had read, about what they believed, about the kind of life each of them, in the private places of their thinking, had always imagined might be possible. He was thoughtful. He listened with the full attention of someone who found the person talking genuinely interesting, not the performance of interest but the real thing. He had opinions that he held carefully, not rigidly, and when she disagreed with something he said, he did not argue for the pleasure of winning, but instead considered her point with actual seriousness. She had not talked this way in a long time, maybe ever in the honest accounting of it. She and Robert had loved each other warmly and well, but they had not talked like this. This felt like something different. This felt like talking to someone who was genuinely curious about who she was. When she walked back to her room afterward, she sat on the edge of the hotel bed and put her face in her hands for a moment, not from sorrow, but from the complicated feeling of realizing that life, the actual living of it, does not stop for grief. Life had the inconsiderate habit of continuing. And sometimes, in its continuing, it offered things that were unexpected and unasked for and not entirely unwelcome. She wrote a letter to her sister Clara that night, by the light of the oil lamp, telling her she was in Fort Dodge and would be arranging passage to Denver within the week. She told her she was well. She told her she had met someone remarkable. She stopped writing after that and looked at what she'd written, and then she folded the letter and sealed it without crossing that part out, because it was true and there was no reason to pretend it wasn't. The next several days in Fort Dodge were the closest thing to an unexpected grace that Lenora had experienced in months. She was waiting for the next available stage connection west toward Pueblo, and then north to Denver, a journey of approximately 2 more weeks that required careful arrangement. Isaiah, true to his word, had found work with the livery, a series of supply runs to ranches south of the fort that paid fair wages and kept him occupied during the days. But the evenings were theirs. They fell into it almost without discussing it, a natural gravity that pulled them toward the same table at supper, the same bench outside the hotel when the evenings were warm enough, the same slow conversations that went longer and longer before one of them noticed the hour. He told her about the cattle drives he'd ridden, the places he'd seen. He had traveled more of the West than most men his age, driven partly by restlessness and partly by the simple economic reality that the work was where the cattle were, and the cattle moved. He had been to Wyoming and Colorado, and as far south as Texas, and as far north as the Montana Territory, once on a drive that had been, by his account, equal parts magnificent and miserable. She told him about teaching herself to read from her father's Bible before there was a school in their town, about the letter writing she'd done for neighbors who couldn't write, about the way she had always believed that there was something important in stories and words that was not trivial even when the people around her suggested it was, about how she had met Robert Brenner at a church social when she was 19, and he had been the first person to ask her what she was reading and mean the question. "What were you reading?" Isaiah asked. "A collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson," she said, "borrowed from the minister's wife." "What did Brenner say about Emerson?" She laughed, a real laugh that surprised her with its ease. "He said he'd never read him, but he'd like to if she was reading him. I told him he was very transparent." Her laughter settled into something softer. "He said he didn't see the point of being anything else." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like he was good," he said. "He was," she said. "He was genuinely good." She looked at Isaiah. "I am not replacing him. I want you to understand that. I'm not looking for someone to fill a space he left. I don't know what I'm looking for. I think I'm just trying to figure out what comes next." "I'm not trying to fill anyone's space," Isaiah said. "I'm just trying to be present in mine." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight outside the hotel, the sound of Fort Dodge settling into its evening around them. "You are a very unusual man, Isaiah Keene." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've been called worse." On the 6th day, something happened that changed the temperature of things in a way that neither of them had quite anticipated. Isaiah had gone out on a supply run to the Henderson Ranch, 15 miles south, and had not returned by evening the way he usually did. Lenora had eaten supper alone and told herself that was fine, that supply runs were not governed by clocks, and had gone to bed and woken up at 3 in the morning to the sound of voices in the street below, and had lain there for a while before getting up and looking out the window. In the lantern-lit street below, she saw Isaiah's roan mare being led to the livery by one of the stable hands, and Isaiah himself walking beside it, moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing pain. His left arm was held against his body in a way that was not natural. Even from the window, in the dark, she could see it. She was dressed and downstairs in under 3 minutes. The story came out in pieces. A wheel had collapsed on the supply wagon 6 miles south, and while they'd been dealing with it, a group of men, not Comanche, not Apache, just ordinary outlaws who worked the Fort Dodge roads with unpleasant regularity, had ridden up with the intention of relieving the supply party of their goods. There had been a confrontation. Isaiah had not started it, but he had most definitely been a part of finishing it, and in the process of convincing the outlaws that the supply wagon was not worth the trouble, he had taken a blow from a pistol butt to his left forearm that had cracked the bone. The fort's doctor, summoned by a very decisive Lenora who had wasted no time at all in determining that the man needed medical attention, confirmed this diagnosis and set the arm and wrapped it with the brisk professional efficiency of a man who had dealt with similar injuries several times a week for years. Isaiah sat through the setting with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the wall, and said nothing except for one word when the bone went back that was not suitable for polite company, and for which he immediately apologized to Lenora, who was standing in the corner of the examination room, because she had not seen the point in standing in the hallway. "You don't have to apologize," she said. "My mother would disagree," he said through his teeth. "Your mother isn't here," she said, "and your arm is broken. You're allowed." The doctor finished his work and left them. Lenora sat in the chair beside the examination table where Isaiah was still sitting with the careful stillness of someone waiting for the acute phase of pain to pass into the merely persistent phase, His right hand was flat on the table. She reached over and put her hand on top of it, just briefly, just a moment. The kind of contact that is not about romance but about presence, about saying I am here, and I see that this hurts and you don't have to pretend otherwise. He looked at her hand on his. Then he looked at her face. Lenora, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He had been extremely careful not to, she realized, because he had been respecting the distance she had not fully established but had implied by her own caution. The distance she had kept because 6 weeks was 6 weeks and grief was grief, and it was not her intention to be a woman who fell into someone else's orbit simply because she was unmoored. But here was the thing about orbits, you could intend all you liked. Yes, she said. He turned his hand so that it was no longer beneath hers but beside it, and his fingers, careful and deliberate, the way everything about him was careful and deliberate, closed around hers. I think you are the most interesting person I have encountered in longer than I can accurately remember, he said. And I think you are going to Denver because you need to, and I think that is entirely right. But I want you to know that I think about that fact more than I ought to. She looked at their joined hands. She looked at his face. She thought about Robert, which she knew she would think about and which she allowed herself to think about because loving someone who was gone was not a betrayal of anyone. It was just love, surviving its object the way love does. Where will you go, she asked, after your arm heals? I was going north, he said. Colorado. Cattle work near the Kansas-Colorado line. That is not far from Denver, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She did not say anything else right away. She let the silence hold what they were both thinking, because sometimes silence is more precise than words. She left for Denver 8 days after that, when the stage connection to Pueblo was arranged. Isaiah rode with her to the stage depot, his left arm in its sling, his roan mare keeping pace alongside the conveyance she was using to get there. He did not try to extend the mourning. He understood, she thought, that drawn-out goodbyes do not actually make the going easier. They just redistribute the grief across a longer period of time. At the stage depot, he helped her get her bag secured, which was slightly complicated by the sling but which he managed with his characteristic refusal to acknowledge that anything was beyond him. Then he stood beside her for a moment while the other passengers loaded. "Write to me," he said. "Care of the Fort Dodge Post. They'll forward it." "I will," she said. "And you, when your arm is healed and you head north, write to me when you know where you'll be." "I will," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking down at her with that particular quality of attention that she had come to understand was simply how he paid attention to things he considered important with his full self, nothing held back or managed. She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. It was the kind of kiss that is offered without calculation, simply because it is what the moment requires. His hand came up and touched her elbow, just briefly, and then she stepped back and climbed into the stage. He stood there until the stage rolled out of the depot and turned onto the western road. She watched him from the window until the road turned and the town fell behind them and he was gone. Clara Meredith, née Brenner, was 30 years old, dark-haired like her sister, and possessed of a practicality that Lenora had always found both comforting and occasionally exhausting. She met Lenora at the Denver stage office with both her children, Thomas Jr., who was 6, and Martha, who was 4 and apparently terrified of very little, and she held Lenora for a long time in the October cold before releasing her and looking at her face with the focused attention of an older sister taking inventory. "You look better than I expected," Clara said. "I look terrible," Lenora said. "You look better than I expected," Clara repeated, which was her way of saying that she had worried considerably more than she was going to admit. Thomas Meredith was a quiet, steady man who was genuinely glad to have Lenora in the house, and showed it by asking her nothing difficult for the first 2 days, and providing excellent coffee every morning. Their house on the edge of Denver proper had a spare room that was not grand but was warm and private, and had a window that looked east, which Lenora appreciated in the mornings when the light came in clear and cold, and everything was very still. She told Clara about Isaiah in small increments, because the full story told at once felt too large for the table or the sitting room, felt like something that needed room. Clara, to her credit, listened without interrupting and without the particular kind of romantic enthusiasm that Lenora had been slightly afraid of, because she was not ready for enthusiasm. She was still in the territory between what had been and what might be. "He gave you his spot on the wagon," Clara said, when Lenora had told her that part. "He did, and then rode after it. He said he was heading north anyway." "He rode after it," Clara said, with the certainty of a woman who had made up her mind about a thing. "Clara, I'm not saying anything. I'm just observing." The first letter from Isaiah arrived in late October. It had been forwarded from Fort Dodge to Denver, and arrived at the house on a Tuesday morning while Lenora was helping Clara with the mending. She opened it at the kitchen table while Clara did not look up from the shirt she was working on with an extraordinary degree of apparent focus. It was 2 pages in a careful, unhurried hand. He wrote that his arm was healing well, and the doctor was satisfied with the progress. He wrote that he had taken on work at the Henderson Ranch for the duration of his recovery, mending tack and helping with inventory, not glamorous but useful. He wrote that Fort Dodge in October was cold in a way that suggested November would be serious. He wrote that he had been reading. One of the older hands had a collection of dime novels that were not Emerson but were certainly eventful and had thought of her. He ended with, "I hope Denver is what you needed it to be. I expect it is, since you strike me as the sort of person who finds what she needs even when it isn't easy." She read it twice and then she wrote back, 6 pages, because she had apparently been saving things to say. Letters crossed the months. November brought long ones, December shorter ones but warmer. He wrote about the ranch, and the first hard frost, and the particular beauty of the Kansas plains under snow, which he described with a writer's instinct he would have denied having if she'd mentioned it. She wrote about Denver and Clara, and the children, and the small work she had found teaching reading and arithmetic to a group of women whose first language was German, and who had arrived in the city that autumn with very little English and even less orientation. "I did not expect to be a teacher," she wrote in December, "but I find that I am quite good at it, which is either a talent I didn't know I had or simply evidence that when you have no particular plan, the universe occasionally provides one." He wrote back, "I think it's both, and I think you were always a teacher. You just hadn't found the classroom yet." By January, they were writing twice a week. By February, the letters had acquired a quality that Miss Aldridge, had she been reading over their shoulders, would have described as deeply romantic, and that both Isaiah and Lenora, being the sort of people they were, would have described as simply honest. In his February letter, Isaiah told her that his arm had healed fully, that the work at the Henderson Ranch had been extended through spring on account of his usefulness and their appreciation of a man who worked without complaint and with considerable skill, and that he had been saving money steadily and was thinking about something larger. He was vague about what that something was, but there was a direction to the vagueness that she could feel even across the distance. She wrote back, "Come to Denver when you're able to." That is an invitation, not a demand, but I find I would very much like you to come. He came in April. She did not know exactly when to expect him, only that he had written to say he was coming in April, and so all through the first weeks of April she found herself noticing horsemen on the eastern roads when she was out, and feeling a particular awareness of the stage depot whenever she passed it. Clara noticed this without comment for approximately 4 days before she said, over the breakfast table, "You could just ask Thomas to keep an eye out at the depot." "I am not that obvious," Lenora said. "You are precisely that obvious," Clara said. "You have looked out the east window 11 times this morning." Lenora did not ask Thomas, but she did walk past the stage depot more often than was strictly necessary. And on the 17th of April, on a morning that was cold enough to see your breath but bright enough to feel like the beginning of something, she walked past the depot, and there was a roan mare tied to the post and a tall figure talking to the depot manager. She stopped walking. Isaiah Keene turned around, as if he had felt the weight of someone watching, and saw her standing in the road about 30 feet away. He was wearing a different coat than the one she remembered from Caldwell, darker, newer, though the hat was the same. His left arm moved freely. The sling was long gone. He walked toward her and she walked toward him, and they met in the middle of the road between the depot and the general store, and for a moment they just looked at each other with the particular quality of people who have been very present in each other's minds and are now required to reconcile the reality with the image. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she said. "Your arm." "Good as new," he said. "Better, maybe. The doc said I'd been abusing it before the break." She laughed. It was easy to laugh with him, she had remembered that, but the reality of it was still something. "How was the ride?" "Long," he said. "I don't mind long." They stood there a moment longer. "Come have dinner with us," she said. "Clara will want to meet you. Thomas too. Come tonight." "All right," he said. He came that night, and Clara subjected him to the kind of systematic inspection that older sisters have been performing on their younger sisters' significant others since the beginning of time, which she did with enough charm that most people would not have recognized it as inspection, though Lenora recognized it in detail. Isaiah, for his part, navigated it with the same patient directness he brought to everything, answering Clara's questions honestly and without defensiveness, talking to Thomas about the cattle operation at Henderson's ranch with genuine interest in Thomas's own surveying work, and managing to endear himself to young Thomas Jr. by knowing an impressive amount about horses, and to Martha by pretending, with great seriousness, to be defeated in a game whose rules Martha appeared to be inventing as she went. After supper, after the children were in bed and Thomas had excused himself with the tactfulness of a good husband, Clara sat at the kitchen table with Lenora and looked at her with an expression that required no translation. "All right," Lenora said. "He is very good," Clara said. "I know," Lenora said. "And he looks at you like you are the only thing in the room that has any light in it." "Clara, I'm just telling you what I see," Clara said. "You don't have to do anything about what I see." Lenora did not go directly to bed that night. Instead, she sat by the window in her room and looked at the lights of Denver, which were more numerous than Caldwell's had been, and less than she imagined any of the great eastern cities would be, but sufficient, alive, particular. She thought about Robert. She let herself think about him fully, the way she had learned to, without flinching away from the good parts or the grief. She thought about the plans they'd had, the life they'd meant to build. She thought that if Robert Brenner could have known Isaiah Keene, they would have liked each other. She thought Robert would have understood what she was beginning to feel, because Robert had been, in the end, someone who believed that love was not a finite resource, that it didn't diminish when it extended to more people and more places and more forms. He had loved her enough to want her to have good things. She had known him well enough to know that. She was not replacing anyone. She was adding to the story, the way stories grow, with new characters and new chapters that do not erase what came before but build upon it. Isaiah stayed in Denver. He found work quickly at a stock operation north of the city that was expanding and needed experienced hands who could also manage logistics, which described him precisely. He rented a room at a respectable boarding house on the north side of town, and fell into the rhythms of Denver with the adaptability of someone who had always found his feet in new places. They saw each other most evenings. He would come to Clara's for supper twice a week, and on the other evenings they would walk. Denver had real sidewalks in parts of the city by 1878, wooden boardwalks at least, and the streets near the commercial district were wide and active enough to walk in the long evenings of spring without it feeling either solitary or improper. They talked about everything. The Colorado spring unfolded around them and they walked through it, talking. About the cattle business and whether it was changing as the railroads expanded, which it was, in ways both promising and uncertain. About the women she was still teaching, 3 of whom were now reading English fluently enough to apply for work in the domestic trades, and who had sent her, collectively, a small bouquet of dried flowers as thanks, which had moved her more than she expected. About his sisters in Abilene, and whether he felt the distance from them, which he did, quietly, in the way of someone who has learned to carry distance without making it the main thing. About her father in Indiana and the complicated relationship she had with him since her mother died and he remarried, which she described with a candor that surprised her but felt appropriate. He told her, on an evening in late May when they had stopped on the bridge over Cherry Creek and were looking at the water, that he had been saving money for a particular purpose and was close to having enough for the first step. "What's the first step?" she asked. "Land," he said. "I've been looking into a parcel north of Denver. Good grazing, decent water, enough timber for a proper structure. A man I know at the stock operation has connections with the land office." He paused. "It would be a small operation at first, maybe 50 head, but it would be mine." She looked at him. "You're going to start a ranch?" "I'm going to try," he said. "I've been working other men's land my whole life. I'm 28. It's time." He was looking at the water, not at her. "I'd want to do it right, with someone beside me, ideally." He stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, very carefully and very honestly, "Isaiah, if you are about to suggest what I think you might be about to suggest, I want you to know that I am not the sort of woman who needs a formal speech or a particular arrangement of circumstances. I just need to know that it's real." He turned fully toward her. "It's real," he said. "It has been real since Caldwell, Kansas. Since you stood in front of Delray Pratt's wagon and asked for a spot with your chin up and your voice perfectly steady when I could see from across the road that you were afraid, and I thought—" He stopped. He started again. "I thought that I had never seen someone more worth helping in my life. And that didn't stop. It hasn't stopped. Every letter, every evening, every conversation. It doesn't stop." She felt something in her throat that was not quite tears but was in the same neighborhood. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't. I love you," he said. "That's the real thing, that's what's real." She reached out and took his hand, the way she had taken it in the doctor's office in Fort Dodge, except this time she was not comforting him and they were not in crisis. They were simply standing on a bridge over Cherry Creek in the Colorado Spring, and the evening light was coming in at an angle that made everything gold. "I love you," she said. "I did not expect to, and I did not plan to, and I am not sorry about either of those things." He kissed her then, for the first time properly, his hand at her face with the same careful deliberateness that characterized everything he did, as though she were something worth being careful with. It was gentle and it was certain, and it was exactly what it was, which was the beginning of something that both of them had been building, letter by letter and evening by evening, for 7 months. Clara's response, when Lenora came home that evening and told her, was to make tea and set out 2 cups and sit down at the kitchen table with an expression of profound and well-earned satisfaction. "I had a feeling about him," she said, "in the Caldwell letter, when you said you met someone remarkable. I told Thomas." "What did Thomas say?" He said, and I'm quoting exactly, "That's good." Clara smiled. "He is a man of many words." Lenora laughed, and it was full and warm and genuine, the laugh of someone who has found their way back to something essential after a long and difficult passage, and it filled Clara's kitchen on that May evening like something that had been missing and was now returned. The proposal happened properly 3 weeks later, not on a bridge but in Clara's garden at the back of the house, which was modest by the standards of what gardens would eventually become in Denver, but was at that moment in late May producing enthusiastic quantities of early herbs and one determined rosebush that Thomas had planted for Clara 2 years ago and had been threatening to bloom ever since. Isaiah arrived with his hat in his hands and a very specific and serious expression that Thomas recognized and Clara recognized, and that he directed entirely at Lenora, who was in the garden because the rosebush had finally, triumphantly, opened 2 small red flowers that morning, and she had gone out to verify them with her own eyes. He said, "Lenora Marie Brenner, I intend to spend the rest of my life learning how to deserve the kind of person you are. I know that the timing of things has not been conventional, and that the circumstances of how we met were not anyone's plan, but I also believe that some things find their way to being regardless of plans. You found your way to being the most important thing in my life, and I would like your permission to keep you there officially in the manner that the world prefers. Will you marry me?" She looked at him, standing in the garden with the rose bush behind him and the morning light very clear and honest around everything, and she said, "Yes, absolutely yes." He had a ring. It was not elaborate, a small band with a single oval garnet set in plain silver, but it fit her finger as though it had been made for it, which he confirmed it had been. Through the jeweler on Blake Street who had taken the measurement from a note she had accidentally left in one of his coat pockets that contained, among other things, her glove size for a pair she'd been planning to order. "You measured my glove size from a note in your coat pocket?" she asked. "It was a reasonable approximation," he said with great dignity. "It fits perfectly," she said. "I know," he said. They were married in September of 1879, exactly 1 year after a wagon rolled out of Caldwell, Kansas with Lenora Brenner on it, because a man named Isaiah Keene had decided she needed the spot more than he did. The ceremony was held at the church on Larimer Street in Denver, which was a proper church by that point with glass in the windows and a minister who had performing a large number of weddings at the Colorado frontier and brought an appropriate level of ceremony to the occasion without excess. Clara stood beside Lenora. Thomas stood beside Isaiah, which he had agreed to with his characteristic economy of words and warmth. The two children, Thomas Jr. and Martha, sat in the front pew with the barely contained energy of children who have been told that this is an important occasion and have interpreted that to mean they should vibrate at a slightly higher frequency than usual. Miss Aldridge was there. She had made the trip from Dodge City, where she was in her 2nd year of teaching and clearly thriving in a way that Lenora found enormously satisfying to see. She sat in the 3rd pew with an expression of open and unabashed romantic satisfaction. The vows they said were the standard ones, the ones the church provided, because both of them believed that the standard ones had lasted as long as they had for reasons that were sufficient. But afterward, in the small reception in Clara's dining room, Isaiah said to Lenora privately, with his hand at her waist and his voice low enough for only her to hear, "I meant all of it, every word, the whole life." "I know," she said. "So did I." They moved onto the land north of Denver that summer, before the wedding, because the practical reality of ranching required it. Isaiah had purchased 48 acres with a small existing structure that had been a homesteader's cabin and was entirely serviceable if you were not particular about elegance, which neither of them particularly was. They expanded it over the first 2 years, as the cattle operation grew and the money with it. But even in its original form, with its single main room and the small sleeping loft, and the cast-iron stove that heated the whole space adequately if you kept the door between the rooms closed, it felt more like a home than either of them had expected a structure of that size and vintage to feel. The cattle herd went from 50 head to 80 in the first year, to just over 100 in the second. Isaiah worked the land with 2 hired hands, a young man named Reeves from Kansas who was hardworking and honest, and an older man named Cole who had been ranching the Colorado Territory for 15 years and knew things about the soil and the grass and the weather patterns that no one had written down anywhere, and that Isaiah absorbed with the focused attention of someone who understands that experience is a form of education. Lenora continued her teaching. She organized a small school for the families within range of their land. There were 6 children of school age within 5 miles, and held classes 3 mornings a week in the cabin's main room when the weather permitted and in the barn when it did not. It was not a formal school. It was not funded by any authority and held no official status. But the children came and the children learned and the parents noticed, and by the 2nd year the county had taken sufficient interest to provide a small budget for materials, which Lenora received with professional dignity and spent entirely on books. In the spring of 1881, their son was born. He was born on a Tuesday in March, in the East Room they had added to the cabin the previous fall, with a midwife named Mrs. Peterson who had delivered approximately 300 children in her career, and managed the whole proceeding with the calm authority of someone for whom new life was simultaneously miraculous and entirely ordinary. Isaiah was present throughout, which was not the universal practice but was, in Lenora's unambiguous opinion, the correct one. He held her hand through the worst of it and said almost nothing, which was exactly right, and when the baby arrived and announced himself with the self-assured vigor of someone who has opinions about the world and intends to express them, Isaiah Keene sat down on the edge of the bed and held his son and looked at him with an expression that Lenora would remember for the rest of her life. They named him Elias after Isaiah's father. Elias Robert Keene, both names intentional, both names carrying weight. Isaiah sent a long letter to his sisters in Abilene that week, and Lenora sent an equally long letter to Clara, and Miss Aldridge sent a gift from Dodge City, a small pair of hand-sewn blankets in soft blues and greens that arrived with a note reading, "I told you it was very romantic." Elias was exactly the kind of baby who makes you understand why people do this more than once, full of warmth and curiosity, and an early disposition toward trying to stand before his body was fully equipped for it, which he accomplished with more enthusiasm than success until the fall, at which point he accomplished it with both enthusiasm and success, and then was unstoppable. He walked at 11 months. He said his first word at 9, which was horse, which seemed inevitable given his parentage and surroundings. He had his father's dark blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and an expression of focused interest when something captured his attention that belonged to both of them and to neither, uniquely his. The ranch grew. A second structure went up in 1882, a proper barn with a hayloft and stalls for 6 horses. Cole retired and was replaced by 2 younger hands, brothers named Sandoval who were originally from New Mexico Territory, and who brought with them an understanding of the southern Colorado land that proved invaluable. Isaiah hired them on full wages, which was not universal practice on ranches of that period, and the Sandoval brothers repaid the respect with loyalty and skill. There were injustices in those years that none of them could pretend away. The Sandoval brothers had stories about how they had been treated in other places, other operations, where their worth had been measured by something other than the quality of their work, and Isaiah listened to those stories with the same serious attention he gave everything, and the wages at the Keene Ranch were fair, and the conditions were decent, and that was what he could do within his particular corner of the world. Lenora thought about the German women she had taught in Denver, about what it had cost them to arrive in a new country with no English and no orientation, about the systems that made some people's passage easier and others' passage nearly impossible. She thought about it and she wrote about it, in letters and in a small journal she kept, because she had always believed that words were not trivial, that naming things was the first act of addressing them. In 1883, she was 30 years old when their second child arrived. A daughter this time, born in August when the Colorado summer was at its most confident, and the light was long and golden and very beautiful. They named her Clara Marie, for the sister who had held open the door when Lenora had needed a door held open. Clara Meredith received the news by letter and replied within the week in a letter that was, for Clara, unusually emotional and therefore all the more precious for being so. 2 children, Clara wrote, and a ranch and a school and a husband who would give up his spot on any wagon to make sure you had a safe ride. You did well, Lenora. You did exactly right. The children grew up together. Elias was thoughtful and physical, simultaneously likely to be found attempting to learn something from Cole or the Sandoval brothers, and attempting to climb something that had not been designed for climbing. Clara, named for her aunt but finding her own character entirely, was precise and curious, and had from a very young age the capacity for focused attention that Lenora recognized as the mark of someone who would find their work and be genuinely good at it. Isaiah taught both of them to ride. He had opinions about the right age to start, which was earlier than most people thought, and opinions about the right approach, which was patient and consistent and never punitive, because horses learned best from confidence, and that was a fact about learning that applied to things other than horses. Elias took to it naturally and exuberantly. Clara took to it precisely, and then once she was precise, also exuberantly. Lenora watched him teach them from the fence on autumn afternoons, the light going amber across the ranch, the children on their ponies navigating the paddock with their father alongside, his voice even and clear and encouraging. And she thought about a wagon rolling out of Caldwell, Kansas, and a man who had given up his spot because someone needed it more than he did. She thought about all the distances between that morning and this afternoon. She thought about how much of life is determined not by plans, but by the specific moments in which one person chooses to be decent to another. She was deeply happy. It was not a thunderous happiness or a showy one. It was the sustained, particular happiness of someone who has built something real from materials that were sometimes difficult, and who looks at the structure of their life and finds it good. Isaiah came to sit beside her on the fence one October evening in 1884, after the children had been brought in for supper and the horses settled for the night. The sky was doing what the Colorado sky does in October, which is to say something extraordinary involving colors that have no adequate names and a depth of blue above the mountains that felt almost architectural. "Do you remember Caldwell?" he said. "I was standing there thinking about it," she said. He looked at the sunset. "I've thought about what would have happened if I'd kept the spot," he said. "Sometimes, I don't worry about it, but I think about it. If I had gotten on that wagon and you had stayed behind, I would have survived," she said. "I'm fairly good at surviving." "You are," he agreed, "but I'm glad I didn't keep it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The mountains held the last of the light and then slowly released it, and the stars came in above the ranch, and the ranch was quiet and whole. "I'm glad, too," she said. In the years that followed, the Keene Ranch became something that people in the county knew as a reliable, well-run operation that produced good cattle and treated its workers fairly. Isaiah's reputation was built on honesty and competence, and the particular kind of steadiness that makes people trust a man with difficult work. Lenora's school, which had grown from 3 mornings a week in a cabin to a proper schoolroom building on the edge of their property that the county now officially recognized and funded, produced children who read and reasoned and calculated with the tools they needed for the world they would face. Several of those children, grown now, wrote to her over the years. She kept all the letters. Elias grew tall and direct like his father, and had his mother's love of books, which he would not readily admit but which showed in the way he wore out whatever reading material came through the ranch. He was 17 when he told his parents he wanted to go to the agricultural college in Colorado Springs to study land management, a thing that made his father quietly proud and his mother openly so. Clara, 15, was already so clearly going to be a teacher that the county school board had offered her mother an unofficial advisory opinion that they hoped to hire her in due course, which Lenora reported to her daughter with satisfaction. "They haven't even seen me teach," Clara said. "They've seen your mother teach," Lenora said. "They're making an inference." "That seems unscientific," Clara said. "It seems accurate," Lenora said. Isaiah, at 34, had the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to be and is finding it exactly as worthwhile as he hoped. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper than they'd been in Caldwell, and the gray was beginning at his temples. But his eyes were the same, that very dark blue that was almost brown in certain light, and they still paid the same quality of attention to the things and people he considered important. He still, on occasional evenings when the work was done and the children were occupied and the ranch was quiet, took Lenora's hand without preamble or announcement, the way he had in the doctor's office in Fort Dodge and on the bridge over Cherry Creek, simply because she was there and he wanted to. She still, on those same evenings, let herself be entirely present in the fact of her own happiness, which was not something she had always been able to do and which she had learned, slowly and specifically, that she was allowed. In the autumn of 1885, when the harvest was in and the cattle were settled, and Elias was away at his first semester of college and Clara was busy with her studies, and the schoolroom was doing well, and the ranch was doing well, and everything had arranged itself into the steady working fullness of a life that had been built with intention and care. Isaiah and Lenora Keene sat on the porch of their house, the house that had started as a homesteader's cabin and had grown, room by room and year by year, into something solid and particular and entirely theirs, and they watched the evening come in over the Colorado mountains. The sky was spectacular, as Colorado skies in autumn are, with layered purples and golds and the kind of clarity that makes distant things look close. The mountains stood against it the way mountains do, without apology or commentary, simply present and vast and indifferent to human observation in the way that makes human observation feel, paradoxically, more significant. "Isaiah," Lenora said. He said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to know that I have considered it carefully before saying it." He turned his head to look at her. His expression was patient and attentive, as always. "I have been happier," she said, "in this life, in this specific life with you on this specific land, raising these specific children, than I believed was possible when I was standing in front of Delroy Pratt's wagon in 1878 trying to figure out what to do with the pieces of a plan that had come apart. I did not think I would have this. I thought I had lost the version of myself who could have this. And I was wrong." She paused. "That's all. I wanted to say it clearly." He looked at her for a moment with those dark blue eyes that had been looking at her clearly and specifically for 7 years, that had seen her in grief and in joy, and in the ordinary middle ground of real days. "I know," he said. "I've known." He took her hand, and for what it's worth he stopped. He looked at the mountains. "Standing in front of that livery in Caldwell, watching that wagon, thinking about you on it, that's when I knew I was done going anywhere alone." She turned her hand so their fingers were linked. They sat like that while the light went from gold to purple to the first dark of the evening, while the ranch settled into its night sounds, and the mountains held their ground against the sky, and the life they had built from a wagon spot, and a storm and a letter, and a ring with a garnet, and all the days and seasons between then and now, spread out behind them complete and intact and real. Not far off, in the warm, lighted kitchen through the window, Clara could be seen at the table with her books, her dark head bent over the page with the focused attention that was hers alone, that no one had taught her and no one could diminish. A lamp burned steadily. The house was warm. The stars were coming in above the ranch one by one, punctual as always, indifferent to human drama and entirely beautiful. The same stars that had burned above Caldwell, Kansas on the night a wagon rolled out with 12 passengers, one of whom should not have been there except that a man had done the decent thing without making a ceremony of it. Isaiah Keene had given up his spot so that Lenora Brenner could have a safe ride. And in return, without either of them having planned it or arranged it or even understood it in the moment, the world had given them this. The porch and the mountains and the children and the cattle and the lamp in the window and the decades ahead, still full of the ordinary, extraordinary richness of a life, shared between two people who chose each other because they were exactly right for each other, even if the choosing had started with nothing more elaborate than a man looking at a woman in front of a wagon and thinking, simply, that she needed the spot more. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. And on that October evening in 1885 on a ranch north of Denver, Colorado, with the mountains holding their place against the sunset sky, and the warm light from the window, and the hand of the woman he loved in his, and the full weight of a life worth living all around him, Isaiah Keene thought that his father, Elias Keene, who had died standing under a tree in a storm so someone else could have shelter, would have understood all of it completely. would have recognized it as the kind of thing that happens when you do what's right without asking what you'll get in return, would have nodded once with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose philosophy had been proven, and then would have said probably that the sunset was something and they ought to enjoy it while it lasted, because evenings like this don't come around every day, and a man who waits for perfect conditions before appreciating a good thing is a man who doesn't appreciate very many good things. Isaiah looked at the sunset. He enjoyed it. Lenora leaned against his shoulder. He leaned back. The evening was beautiful. The ranch was whole. The life was full. That was how it was.